Hello and welcome back to part 2 of this sci-fi gun tutorial. And in the first part we looked at creating the shockwaves for the gun, and in the second part we're going to look at compositing the result. So the first thing I did was I took Sebastian's footage of his flat and I redesigned his flat. So it looked like this, give it a bit of a grade, and I applied a scope mask so it all looks a little bit more cinematic. But this is obviously beyond the scope of this tutorial, so I won't waste time explaining how I did that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is navigate to the frame where the gun goes off, and that's just before the recoil there. Then I'm going to navigate to my elements folder, and I've made that blast composite, the last thing we did at the end of part 2. I'm going to bring that into a new group here. Just going to close up that scope mask just to not confuse things, and I'm going to lock it. Okay, I'm going to drag this blast composite along till it's... So I'm just grabbing it on the mini timeline. I just want to find a frame that looks like it's going to do me. I think that probably that one is good. And then I'm going to hit I on the keyboard to chop it off. I'm going to step forward 2 frames and hit O to chop it off. Now let me come over to the inspector, properties, set the blend mode to linear dodge. Let's view, show overlays, and just position that there. Now let's zoom in a little bit, because what I want to do is adjust the scale of this and the rotation so it's sort of matching our muzzle. So let's come down a bit like that. I think we can afford to rotate it a little bit like that. Let's just scale it in a little bit more. So the next thing is to come over to the library, filters, blur, and good old zoom blur, and we'll add that to the blast composite. Now let's grab the on-screen widget there and drag it backwards along the line of the gun till we've got something like that. Next I want to come to the top of this group, come back to the library and look for color correction and grab our levels filter, apply that. Applying that obviously changes the blend mode of the group, so we need to come over to the inspector, set that again to linear dodge. Let's step into the filter, let's select the red channel, bring the white value right down, select the green channel, do the same thing, till we get this really intense burnout there. So the next thing I want to do is select that blast composite layer, right click, make clone layer. Just want to hold down the shift and option keys and scale this one down a bit to about there. Let's just have a quick look how that works. I'd just like to come in and adjust the zoom blur. So I'm going to come to that first frame, that's 205. I'm going to set a value of 3, set a keyframe, step forward 2 frames and set a value of 5. So it starts to shoot out a bit more, and I think that's going to give me more of a nice blast there. Okay, so just let's have a look right up close. You'll see that the actual point at which the bullet is coming out of the gun is not actually as bright as it should be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the circle tool, come over to the window, show HUD, make sure I've got a fill color of white, no outline, and I'm just going to draw an ellipse just where that muzzle is, just like that. Select the transform tool, show overlays, and let's just rotate it a little bit like that. So let's just come over to the circle fill feather here and set that to 15. And let's zoom back out again and see if that works. Oops, no it doesn't, because we need to come to the frame at which the flash happens, hit I on the keyboard, and also hit O on the keyboard to trim it just to last for that frame. So let's see how that works. Nice bright center to the flash. Okay, so next I want to add a camera to add a little bit of handheld movement and then a nice big shake as the gun goes off. So come to Object, New Camera, switch to 3D. I've locked my scope mask so that's not being affected, and so everything will move behind the mask, which is good. Come to the camera, come to the library, come to behaviors, and I'm going to look for parameter, and I'm going to select wriggle and apply that to the camera. I'm also going to select randomize and apply that to the camera. I'm going to come to the inspector. First I'll select the wriggle. I will set the apply mode to add and subtract. I will apply two properties, transform position X and Y. And I'm just going to reduce that wriggle amount down to 10. And we'll set the frequency down to 0.2. So let's see how that plays. We get this nice little camera drift as though it's handheld, and that's good. So let's come back to 205. Let's turn on the randomize behavior. Let's set the apply mode to add and subtract. Again, let's set the apply to properties, transform position X and Y. I'm going to set a keyframe here of 15 for the amount. I'm going to step back one frame, set it down to 0. And I'm going to come forwards to 2 seconds and 20 frames on the timeline and reduce the amount down to 0 again. So now if we press play, you can see we get that really good kick as the gun goes off, and that's going to really add realism to the effect. Okay, so let's add some shockwave displacement to make this start to come alive. I'm going to come back to my file browser, and I'm going to grab my blast composite and I'm going to drag it in right at the back of everything. I don't need to see this. It's going to be the displacement map for the shockwave. So I'm going to turn that group back to 2D. I'm going to come over to the inspector and I'm going to set it to fixed resolution. Then what I want to do is I want to select my action group. This is my base plate of Sebastian firing the gun. Come to the library, filters. I want to come down to distortion and I want to grab bump map and I'll add it to that group. Then I'm going to come to the inspector. I'm going to take this group here and add it to the image map well for the bump map, and I'm going to turn the value all the way up to 1. Just going to call this group displace. Let's come to about 211 and let's grab the blast composite layer and drag it along on the timeline till we start to see the result. What we can do is come to properties. Let's move it up a bit so it's more in line with the gun. I think what I want to do is extend it on X, so stretch it out a bit, and that looks a bit more dramatic, I think. And what I might also do is right click, duplicate, come to properties, set the blend mode to linear dodge, and this one I'm going to slide down the timeline a bit, so I'll probably come just a few frames later so we get a double whammy of this, and maybe just increase the overall scale of this one. We just need to check our position, bring that centered up on the muzzle of the gun. Let's do the same with the other one. Oh no, that's way up there, isn't it? Let's bring that over a bit more scientific. Although actually, to hell with science, let's go for art and let's drag that across a bit like that. And let's see how that plays. So that's really dramatic. It's actually probably deforming it a bit too much, but I wanted to give you the full works there. Let's come to the library, filters, blur, Gaussian blur, and let's add it to the displace group and come to the inspector. And then let's just adjust the blur amount till we're softening off some of the more extreme results of that. That should do. Let's take our second blast composite and I just want to rotate that through 180 degrees so we're not the same as the other one. And I want to come down to its timing and I'm just going to adjust that speed down to 60% and we'll set the frame blending to optical flow and it'll calculate a smoother slow-mo for that. And that's going to look something like that. Because what I've done is actually taken Sebastian at the moment at which the gun goes off and slowed him right down, and then later on he comes back to normal speed. So we actually can extend this moment in time. And of course, if you think this displace effect is still too extreme, you can come back to the bump map amount and just reduce that. Let's come down to about 0.6. Right, I think it's time for some proper shockwave action, don't you? Let's come over to the file browser, let's grab blast composite, and bring it in to the top here. Just going to call that group there Flash, so we know what it is, and close it down. I'm going to call this one Shockwaves. Okay, so I'm going to select my blast composite here, and let's come to frame 205 again, and let's drag it along so it starts at that frame. Let's come over to the inspector, properties, and then let's set the blend mode to screen. Let's turn on the overlays, and let's just move this little fella up till we're on the muzzle of the gun. As I say, we slow mode the action, so what I'm going to do is again set the speed down to 60% and frame blending to optical flow, and then I'm going to come over to the library. I'm going to look for filters, color correction, levels, add that to that layer, come to the inspector, let's do the same thing, grab the red and bring the white level down, grab the green, bring the white level down as well. So that's already quite good. What we need to also to do is to add a fade in, fade out. So select that layer, library, behaviors, basic motion, fade in, fade out. Let's come to the inspector, let's set a fade in time of 2 frames and a fade out time of 16 frames. Okay, it's starting to look good. But really what it ought to be doing is it ought to be moving forward along the line of the gun. So I'm going to select the blast composite, I'm going to come to the library, behaviors, basic motion, and I'm going to select motion path, and I'm going to add that. Then I'm going to make sure my overlays are turned on, view show overlays, and scroll over a bit. My start point obviously is going to be the gun. I'm going to turn off dynamic guide because that's interfering with me at this point. I'm going to zoom right out, discover where that end point is, and I don't really want it to go too far, so I'm going to bring it in like that, and then we can zoom back in again and see what's going on. There you go, I'm on the line of the gun. So then I'm going to come to the inspector, and I'm going to twirl open the control points. And what I want to do is for point 2, I want to bring it out on Z. So I'm going to set a value of 250 on Z. So it's now moving towards the camera as well as across on that path. And something's gone a bit screwy there because I didn't line that up with the first frame. So let's grab that point 1, and move it to the muzzle of the gun. And maybe we can move this second point along just a bit further. It doesn't want to go too far, it just wants to have that sense of a drift. Now the other thing I've forgotten to do is to angle this so it's angled correctly for the gun. So let's select that, come over to the properties, transform, rotation, and let's set a Y rotation of 10 degrees. And you can see that sort of aligned the plane a bit more to the angle of the gun, and that should work a bit better. We could even have a very slight X rotation, just a couple of degrees, and then it's heading upwards as well. So this is looking pretty nice already, but I think we can improve it by adding a few more elements. So I'm going to right click, duplicate, and first of all I'm going to come over to the properties. What I want to do is rotate it through 45 degrees on Z, and in order to make it different I'm going to affect the motion path for this. So make sure our overlays are turned on, and I just don't want it to move quite as far, so this one is going to come to about here. And then I'm going to come to properties, and let's scale it down to about 65%. And you can see that's now giving me this slight sense of parallax. What I might even do is select that layer and drag it a couple of frames later. And that's going to move it even further back. And that's quite nice. What I also want to do is come to the levels control here, switch to the blue channel, and I'm going to increase the blue black. And you can see that's giving me a slightly richer colour. Let's have a quick render of that. So for our next trick, let's add a slightly different shockwave. Come over to the file browser. I'm going to select Skinny 3, which was one of the elements that we created originally, and I'm going to bring that in at the top of that shockwaves group. And then I'm going to come to 205 as we do before, drag this along so it starts at 205. I'm going to come to the inspector. We're going to select Properties, Blend Mode, Screen. We want to set the center point up here. I'm going to select the motion path and the fade in, fade out and the levels from the previous layer. And holding down the Alt key, I'm going to drag them onto this new layer. So we're copying those over. So we just need to adjust a few things here. First of all, we need to change that speed. Let's come to 60% again. And again, let's make sure we are using optical flow. Let's come up to the top here and let's set those rotation values. So I think we had -3 on X and 10 on Y. And we'll probably just scale this down. So I'm going to scale that down so it's sort of sitting in the middle of the mix a bit more, somewhere like that. I think that's looking rather nice. Okay, let's come to the levels here and let's select the blue again and let's drag that up a bit more so it's even richer than it was before. Let's select the red and drag the white level down so this is starting to be seriously intense. And let's do the same for the green, why not? There you go. And maybe even the RGB, just so that's a seriously burnt out version. Let's have a quick look at how that looks. And you can see how that's added quite a bit of richness and interest. I'm not going to get too carried away with these shockwaves. I think you've got the overall idea. One thing I do want to do is to give an impression of how those shockwaves are illuminating the space. So I'm going to select that lowest version, the first one we created, right click, duplicate. I'm going to come over to Properties, set its scale to 150%. Then I'm going to come to the library, Filters, Blur, and I'm going to grab Gaussian Blur, add that to that layer, come to the inspector, set an amount of 250. And then I'm going to come over to Properties, set the blend mode to Linear Dodge. And you can see how that's giving me this sort of halo around everything. Just a little bit too bright at the moment, so I'm going to come over to Filters, Levels, and I'm going to grab the blue channel and grab the black value there. So we're getting a nice rich glow. So you can really see how that's giving a sense of the shockwaves lighting up the scene. Right, so the final major element that we need to construct is a bullet or projectile. So I'm going to come to frame 205 and I'm going to turn off the shockwaves and flash group just so we can see what's happening. I want to make a new group at the top here, so Object, New Group. I'm going to call this Geometry. And I want to come down and grab the Line tool. And then I want to draw along the line of the gun to give myself a guide for the path of the bullet. So let's do something like that. That's good enough. That's our path. Then in the same group, I want to come down and look for the Circle tool. I'm going to come to Window, Show HUD. We want an outline, no fill, and width of 2 will do to start off with. And holding down the Shift and Alt key, I'm just going to drag a circle out like that across the muzzle of the gun. Then with the circle selected, I want to come to Object, Replicate, and that's made a new group down here at the bottom for some reason. I'm going to drag that up to the top, and I'm going to select the replicator. For the shape, I'm going to select Line, and I want to turn it to 3D. I'm going to set the X start point to 0 and the X's end to 0. And then I just want to select the group and hit I on the keyboard. And I want to come to 3 seconds and 12 frames and hit O. So we've truncated that to run for just that duration. Let's come back to our replicator. I want to twirl open the end point controls here, and I want to set a global keyframe for the end point, so that's the top one here. And I'm going to step forward 3 frames, and then I'm going to set an X value of 150, a Y value of 35, and a Z value of 350. That's more or less going along our line. The Y value looks a bit off, doesn't it? Let's bring that down a bit. There we go. I'm going to set the number of points to 15. Then I'm going to come down to the bottom here, and I'm going to set the scale randomness, which is this one here, to 100. And I also want to come to the geometry group, select the circle, and just adjust its Y rotation to 20 degrees. This will become a bit more obvious what's going on here very shortly. So if I just step back, you'll see that the bullet assembles itself over those few frames. So let's come back to 205, and what we need to do is make sure the bullet flies along our path. So I'm going to grab the group here, and we're going to call this bullet, and come back to the library. I'm going to look for behaviors, basic motion, and we're going to use motion path again and apply it to that group. And then we need to make sure our overlays are turned on. Then let's just come a few frames forward so we can see our path. And I want to grab the end point, and we want to make sure that our bullet is lined up on our line like that. And there you go. Okay, let's step forward a few frames so we can see the bullet in flight. I'm going to come to the library, look for filters, blur, and I'm going to look for directional blur, and I'm going to add it to my bullet group. Then, making sure my overlays are turned on, I'm going to use this arrow here to line up the blur. So let's go for something like that. So we can use the line, the path that we've created, to get the correct angle for our directional blur. Let's come over to the inspector. We don't need a huge blur amount, so let's turn that down to 50, and we can turn off the path. And hopefully you can now see that our bullet has got a little bit of 3D volume, and that's what we're aiming for. Let's come to the replicator and come down to its cell controls here. I want to turn on additive blend. Color mode I want to set to over pattern, and I'm going to twirl open the gradient. This left hand color tab I'm going to move to the center. The right hand one, let's click on the swatch, let's make this a darker blue, and let's set a color tab over on the left hand side, and this time let's go for something a bit more in the red direction, so we're sweeping through the colors there. Maybe we can increase the brightness of our center. Let's come over to properties, blend mode, and set that to linear dodge. I also want to come to my bullet group and come to the library, come to color correction, and I want to grab channel mixer, and I'm going to add that above the directional blur. Let's step back a few frames so where bullet is still in frame. We're going to come down to the alpha output, and I'm going to increase the alpha blue to 0.2. Actually, maybe even go further. And you can see that doing so punches it through a bit more. And it's quite a useful trick. So we're basically using the luminance of the blue channel to add to the alpha, and that's giving us a little bit more solidity. Okay, so I'm going to come back to my geometry group, and I'm going to select the circle, and I'm going to right click duplicate, and I'm going to call this core. And what I want to do is I want to change the outline brush type to airbrush. I'm going to set the width to 15, and the spacing I'm going to set all the way up to 350. If you see up here in that little icon, or rather if we solo that in fact, you can see I've created this 5-point shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the replicator and right click duplicate. I'm going to call this replicator core and call the cell core as well. And I'm going to drag that core image into the particle cell. And what that's done is it's given me these nice streaks there. I'm going to turn my path back on again, and I'm going to come to the replicator core controls here. I'm going to come back to the keyframe that we've set there. And I just want to extend it a little bit further along the path. So I'm going to select the Adjust Item tool, make sure my overlays are turned on, and I can drag this along the path in that direction. I'm also going to drag it back like that. And I want to come down here to the scale for this replicator, and let's try turning that down to about 60. So let's turn off the path. I'm just going to grab the bullet group, and I think I'm going to move it forward just a couple of frames. 207. So let's turn everything back on again and see how it's all working. So there you go. I've added some smoke and some particles just to give it a bit more interest, but I won't waste your time in showing you how to do that because that's quite time consuming. What I do want to do as one final thing is I don't feel that the room is being lit up quite enough. This is a humongous blast and I think we'd get a bit more illumination. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my action group, come to the library, filters, color correction, and I'm going to grab levels and add it to that group. And come to frame 205, and I'm going to hit I on the keyboard to chop it off at that point. Then I'm going to come to the inspector. I'm going to select the red channel, bring down the white value a lot, and do the same thing with the green channel. So we're getting this pretty pronounced burnout here. And I think that's going to look much better there. What I'm going to do is I'm simply going to animate the mix value. So I'm going to set a keyframe here. Then I'm going to come forward 316 and I'm just going to set that mix value back down to 0. And let's have a look how that looks. Okay, so that's the tutorial finished. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you again on the next one.